Hey everybody, it's Robert. Thanks for tuning in to Mentors for Military, and I'm sitting here with my co-host, Kyle Neal.
Hey guys, it's Kyle. How are y'all?
So we're sitting at Pearl and Pine Brewery once again, and really appreciate these guys for loaning us their facility and allowing us to come in here and tape our podcast episode. So if you're ever in Sonoy, Georgia, where they filmed The Walking Dead, make sure you come by here, check the place out, have a couple beers, say hello to Sam and Matt. Mention the podcast, and that's the reason why you're here. So we're joined today with somebody. I think we've been trying to coordinate this podcast now for years. It seems like. So we're joined by Dr. Kate Pate, and thank you so much for coming on the show and joining us here all the way from Montana.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been a long time coming.
Where is home, though? You mentioned Colorado. You've mentioned Montana.
Yep. Yeah, I don't know that I really have like a place that I call home. It's just kind of, I've always been a little bit of a wanderer. I grew up actually not that far from here. I grew up in Florida.
No way.
And we used to vacation near Callaway Gardens and Red Top Mountain and Pine Mountain and stuff. So I grew up in the Southeast.
Yeah.
I have family in North Carolina, South Carolina, all over Georgia and Florida. So home originally was here for me, but then my family just moved around a ton. My dad was in the military, but that wasn't really, he was out by the time we came along, and we just moved from, all over the state of Florida. We lived in Texas for a long time. I went to school in Virginia for a little while. I lived in Colorado, Montana, Alabama even. I'm just kind of going where the wind blows, I guess.
It's got gypsy blood, Rob.
Yeah, a little bit of gypsy blood for sure. But I love the West. I love the Mountain West, and that's really where, if I had to pick a home, it would be like more regional. It would just kind of be out west in the Rockies.
So when you say Florida, where about in Florida?
I was actually born in Vero Beach on the East Coast. And then we lived in Naples for a number of years, Tampa for a number of years. Gainesville is where I went to school, so I was a Gator for undergrad and grad school. Yep. I usually take some heat from that one.
That's pretty gross, guys.
LSU.
Yeah, that's tough.
That's tough. And then I have family in Miami, which is where my parents met and lived most of their lives,
Right.
and then family in Tallahassee too. So.
When you end up going into to college and stuff, you end up getting, at the end at least, obviously you're a doctor, of a pretty good degree. So what led you down that path? What made you go down that path of studying medicine?
Man, I was the kind of kid that loved everything. So all of the subjects, I was just like, I want to learn more. And I was very, very nerdy, lots of books. I had like neuroscience for dummies when I was like 9 years old or something. I just loved science and anything that I just found intriguing. And so science was always the one thing that I dug into, and that was a kind of a common thread from when I was young into school. And I had no idea what I wanted to be. When I was younger, I thought maybe veterinary medicine, and so my undergraduate degree, believe it or not, is zoology and French, which has nothing.
French.
Yeah, I know. It has nothing to do with what I do now. But I thought, hey, these are interesting. My parents were like, follow what you like, and it doesn't lead to a great career sometimes, but that's what I did. And then when I was graduating, so I moved around. My freshman year, I was at the University of Virginia. My sophomore year, I was at the University of Texas. And my junior year, I was at the University of Florida. It's a long story as to why I bounced around, but I went to school, summer school, every time I switched schools. And by the time I was like halfway through my junior year, I was talking to the counselor, and they were like, you have enough credits, you're going to graduate at the end of your next semester. And I was like, shit, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, I'm not ready. I thought I had another year.
I have to be an adult now?
Yeah, like, wait a minute. I'm like 19 years old, 20 years old. So I had a physiology professor who was like, Kate, you're really good at this. Like, it clearly makes sense to you. Neuroscience and physiology are what you're good at. You should pursue that and do a graduate degree. And I was like, well, I thought I wanted to, go get a clinical medical degree. And he was like, no. You that's for other people. People like you need to go do research. And I was like, I had never done research before. I didn't know that I really wanted to do it, but I was like, if I could study this and like really like spend time with this material that I love so much, that sounds awesome. And medical school to me was like study, memorize, purge the information. Study, memorize, purge. It wasn't, I wanted to spend time and think about these things. So I actually was really encouraged to go get a PhD, having no idea what that entailed, and applied, got a scholarship to go at the University of Florida. Since I was already there, it kind of made sense. I made really good connections to professors. And
really good medical school as well.
Really good medical school, excellent veterinary school. I ended up teaching, as I was going through my graduate degree in neurophysiology there, I ended up actually being able to teach in both the medical school and the veterinary school. I taught anatomy and TA'd different courses, and it was really cool. I had incredible experiences there. And I kind of always have gone back and forth with like this desire to pursue a clinical degree and then my love of, like the research side. And I don't know that that's ever going to go away. I mean, there are multiple times that I just started the applications to medical school thinking I wanted to go do clinical work and then withdrew them because I was like, no, that's not the right path for me. I'm not, but it's my love of working with people and it's my love of solving problems that, pulls me to that. I like to do the hands-on stuff and have a direct relationship with people. And sometimes in research, you're far from the people that you're helping.
Yeah.
So
that's funny because in my experience, like neurologists or neurophysiologists or anybody, they're kind of like the
weirdos,
the doctors, like the ones that, you know what I mean?
You can say it.
You don't look like, well, that's all I'm saying is like, you're not like the typical neurologist or neurophysiologist that I've seen.
Yeah, no, I don't really fit into very many boxes. I confuse people. I tell folks that I speak hippie, scientist, and knuckle dragger equally well. And that's like I'm
nice.
Fluent in all of those.
Nice.
And I just don't, I think that's why I had such a hard time with my research because I had so many interests and ways of relating to people or ideas that never really quite fit the niche that you're supposed to create for yourself in academia. It was like, I don't want to just pigeonhole myself into this one thing or this box. It doesn't make sense for who I am. So I've been like kind of a rogue researcher throughout my career.
So I guess the University of Florida and the doctorate program taught you how to speak nerd.
Yeah.
What taught you to speak hippie?
That's a great question. I think there's something inherent in me, maybe, that's a little bit of a free spirit.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the gypsy way that we grew up. My parents were also hippies at heart, even though now they're very like conservative and sort of, they went through a period of time where that was like, hippies are, those are those other people. We don't, like we would never associate with those people. It's, very, very different. But as they're getting older, they're kind of going back to their hippie roots. So part of me wonders, maybe it's some of the nurture kind of things that I learned from them, and maybe it's just like part of our family.
Was there ever a Volkswagen van and bare feet in this story somewhere?
Oh yeah.
Was it?
My parents had, they had the. They didn't do the Volkswagen van with like the peace sign on it, but they were definitely little flower children. My mom made all their own like wedding clothes with flowers in it, and my dad had long hair and played a guitar and wrote poetry and music, and it's pretty funny.
Solid.
Yeah.
So when you came out of the program, and what did you get your degree in first off?
So technically, it's physiology. Our focus, our lab, was neurophysiology. So it's the study of kind of how the brain influences and controls physiology. So you learn, like in medical school, I took all of those physiology courses. Neuroscience is a organ system that is part of physiology, but we looked at, so we studied all of that, but then we looked at really taking a deep dive into the brain and the brain aspects of physiology and how it controls every body system. And our emphasis in our lab and what we studied most was the respiratory system. So kind of the brain, breath, body connection. And that was, you can relate that to the hippie roots too with breath work. And
I just got the video of Wim Hof breathing in my mind right there.
Yeah.
Like how you survive 20 minutes in negative 20 water or whatever. I don't even know how cold it is, but like that dude just breathes it out, man.
Yeah, that plus cold plunges. It's all the rage these days.
Yeah, that's what Joe Rogan told me anyway.
Oh, okay.
Everyone's doing it.
Well, and I think, that people understand that we have nerves and the brain and the whole bit, but I don't think a lot of people understand more like the interconnectivity and the jellyfish kind of thing where you got the brain and then all the tentacles that come down and how important it is. I don't know, like a lot of people, we're going to get into your trip down to Peru and stuff like that, but a lot of people the connectivity of the human body is just amazing as a tool itself. How it all functions. It's very interesting. And of course, at the heart of this is not just the heart, but the lungs and then the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was, I think, what drove my passion for neurophysiology was the fascination with the brain. And I always look at neuroscience and what we know about it is it sort of reminds me of where physics was right before we discovered quantum physics. Like, we think we know a lot, but I think we're like so far behind in really understanding what's going on. And maybe there's going to be a breakthrough in some way where we're going to be like, whoa, we know nothing about this, or what we thought we knew was all wrong. So that's kind of exciting about neuroscience. But I always was interested in it, one from a physiological standpoint, but the other, I mean, the way that our brain works really colors everything about our experience. And everything from emotions to our perspectives on the world to how we feel, what we like, what we don't like. And so studying that and understanding the physiological influences and that bidirectional relationship between the body and the brain and the brain and the body was interesting, but also from like a neurotrauma standpoint. Well, what happens if it's injured? Then what does that mean physiologically? What does that mean for your experience of life? Because we are sensory beings, and that's your nervous system. So if things start to get damaged or injured, what does that mean? So I started to pivot away. I loved the brain, breath, body stuff, but when I finished my degree, I wanted to pivot a bit and do something different. Again, this is why I was a bad scientist, but I didn't stay in my field. It was like, man, I'm fascinated by neurotrauma. I want to study traumatic brain injury. And so that's part of my postdoc work in Denver. After I left UF, I went to Denver, was looking at traumatic brain injury and inflammation and seeing if we could deal with that inflammation cascade after an injury to maybe promote better outcomes. And again, these were animal studies, so.
Can you go a little bit more deeper into the traumatic brain injury aspect of things? Because, I mean, traumatic brain injury could happen as a kid falling off your bike and hitting your head or something, or, even there's certain aspects of it, of lower degrees of, the waves of music and the sound and those types of things that can even mess with the brain. And so my pea brain, of how I understand it, is that your brain's kind of floating in some liquid, and then when something comes in and it impacts it in a way, there may be some form of scar tissue that forms or things that it's doing to protect itself. And I don't even know if I'm right on the subject or not, but
yeah, you're pretty close. I mean, I like to describe it as like a plate of Jell-O. If you could imagine like a giant plate of Jell-O, and you could kind of move the plate around and see how flimsy it is and how it moves. That's kind of the consistency of brain tissue. And it's encapsulated by these different layers that are protective. And there's a fluid around that, the cerebrospinal fluid, that cushions it like airbags kind of. And there's a lot more that the cerebrospinal fluid does. And that's sort of the structure inside of the skull, which is obviously bony, and there's a lot of protrusions that can be sharp. But again, you have these protective layers, and there's one of these three layers that cover the brain is actually pretty dang thick. So it's moving around normally you're not going to have damage. But you could imagine, since it's mostly water, that if you have any kind of So there's two different types of injuries that we talk about that have relevance to the military. So one is blunt trauma, and that's the kind you think about with sports or hitting your head against something or something hitting your head, where there's a force applied to the skull, and then your brain kind of moves within the skull, and you have sort of this initial insult where that tissue hits the skull, and maybe there's some damage there, but there's always that rebound. So you think about the Jell-O and how it jiggles back and forth when you move the plate. Well, that's kind of how it works in the brain. So your brain might slam into one side of the skull, but it's going to rebound into the other. And so you kind of have this coup contra coup injury. And that's a physical, blunt trauma kind of injury. But then you have blast trauma. And again, because the brain is mostly water, you've got places in the brain where the density of the material of the neurons and what makes up the brain, some parts are way more dense than others. And so when you send an overpressure blast wave through something that's water with different densities, the wave vibrates the water at a certain frequency, but when it hits denser material, the vibration or the frequency that it vibrates changes and shifts. And so you don't have a uniform vibration. And where there's a shift in density, sometimes that vibrational change can cause shearing, and that can cause almost like tearing of the neurons and the axons and all of the cells in the brain. Looks like there's a question.
That it would be like the broken connections of the brain being able to speak to other parts of the brain correct, like when that happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if like for the layman's term, like I got put on prenatal vitamins after my TBI.
Okay.
She said something about folic acid. It helps bridge gaps in the brain.
Yeah.
Would that be the reason for that? Or try to heal something like that as best as you can through vitamins or whatever? Not saying vitamins are the...
Sure. They are essential for neuronal health and synaptic signaling, but it is definitely more complicated than that. So when we talk about injuries, I want you guys to think about what happens in your brain. You can liken it to an injury, like say you cut your arm. There is a normal process with an injury where you have inflammation, you have recruitment to that area of immune cells. They clean up all the garbage and the dead cells and the torn tissue. They get rid of any bacteria, and then they remodel the tissue, and you're probably going to have a scar, but eventually it's like, oh, I'm healed, right? Like there's probably a scar, but it's a healed tissue. Well, the same thing happens in the brain. So we talk about injuries and inflammation. Those things are normal, and that's good. It's part of a healthy process of healing. And most people who get some kind of brain injury are going to heal okay, just like you would heal an arm. And you know, when people hear TBI, they think inevitable damage, inevitable problems, inevitable consequences that are going to be long-term and affect me for the rest of my life. And I want to disprove that because it's a scary thing, and it doesn't always turn out that way. However, the thing with inflammation and brain injury, and you know, this talk about supplements or vitamins, one of the things that can happen is when you have that inflammatory response and your brain is like, oh shit, alarms, you know, we got to clean up this tissue and remodel it and make sure everything's good moving forward. That inflammation actually doesn't subside. So normally it peaks and then it kind of dissipates over time. Sometimes that inflammation persists, and the inflammation persisting is what causes then more damage over time. It can cause swelling, but it can also cause continued damage because you have all of these some of these immune cells release things that can, like free radicals, that can damage tissue over time. And then that's what we think that this chronic inflammation is what leads to long-term damage. That doesn't seem to resolve. And so if you can address the chronic inflammation and hopefully fix that, then hopefully the symptoms associated with that will go away. The problem is, you know, in order to heal properly, we've got to be taking excellent care of ourselves. And you think about the military, when people get TBIs, what are they doing? They're probably drinking, they're sleep deprived, they're chronically moving, you know, just tons of intense physical stress. You know, they may be taking uppers and downers, they may be, you know, all of these different things. Their gut health is probably super poor. What are they eating? You know,
tornadoes and Monster Energy drinks.
You know, like you already have a baseline inflammatory state in your body. So when you have a brain injury and you're treating your body like this, you're already probably dealing with some baseline inflammation in the brain, not to mention the gut and elsewhere. So when you have an injury like that, you're not really giving yourself a fighting chance at recovering well. So this is a point I want to stress to people. Taking care of yourself and doing the right thing to stay healthy is also preventative. So if you do get a TBI, you might recover better. It's like, don't wait till you get a TBI to turn your, to take care of it. It's like, if you can stay ahead of that, that would be ideal. But I mean, the culture is what it is.
So like cutting out inflammatory foods like dairy or gluten or something like that, or alcohol, or all the things that everybody loves, you know, like White Russians and you know, chips and stuff. You know what I mean? Like all the
Right.
good stuff.
Yeah.
But so you're saying that is like kind of like a preemptive measure that you can do to help in the event that you do get a traumatic brain injury or whatever. Like if you're already like cutting down on inflammation across the body.
It can be it can be a really important way to create a more anti-inflammatory state. And the gut is actually, I mean, people talk about the gut microbiome and gut health, and nobody really, they're like, well, what is it really? And like, is it really doing anything? And the truth is it is. You think about that as a barrier to what you consume, you're putting into your mouth, and it goes into your body, and it's full of whatever, bacteria, whatever. You don't want that to get into your bloodstream. So your gut is actually a barrier from the external world to your internal world, and it's selective about what things are absorbed and what gets moved across into your blood. When you have things that inflame the gut, so it could be like maybe a gluten intolerance or dairy or alcohol, that affects everybody like this, where you normally have these super tight junctions in between these epithelial cells in your gut, and that's a healthy gut. You may have heard the term leaky gut. That happens when these tight junctions loosen due to inflammatory reactions in the gut, and that could be due to a food intolerance or an infection of some kind or something like that. And then what happens is, because of that, now you have things moving across into the bloodstream that shouldn't be there and causes inflammation. So if you can repair your gut and address gut health through eating lots of fiber and fruits and vegetables, staying away from things that you can feel the difference that make you worse, that can be really helpful. And it's bidirectional. So you guys, I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but if you've ever had a traumatic brain injury, sometimes you have inflammation in the gut afterwards, because there's this vagus nerve runs from your gut to your brain and sends information both ways. And so sometimes the inflammation in the brain can actually cause an inflammatory response in the gut and cause leaky gut. And so if you address this from either end of the spectrum, you're doing yourself a huge favor. So anything to promote, kind of a more anti-inflammatory state in the body, whether it's through supplements, diet, getting enough rest, staying away from things that cause problems. Like those are, it's not exciting, and it's not like a cool like silver bullet, but this is stuff that it's good to implement over time.
So getting back to the dispel of long-term chronic TBI challenges is going to affect you. I mean, I'm married to a nurse, and we've got friends that are in the health space and stuff, and I have bad hearing, so that's a sensory thing. Oh, TBI, it's like all of these sensory things. Oh God, you're going to end up with Alzheimer's and getting fed through a tube or whatever. You know what I mean? And it's like,
right.
Seriously. I mean, there's people who like go to the extreme. I think what you're stating, if I heard you correctly, is there are early symptoms that you may be experiencing after a TBI that should be indicators as to whether or not it is going to be chronic. Would that be a correct statement? Or is it something that you might not know that it's going to end up being that challenge, because the signs may not be strong enough to know that it may be long-term inflammation in there?
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes you don't know. I think sometimes the immediate period after a brain injury is you're going to feel off, and that's pretty normal. But it should resolve. And when it doesn't, or it resolves and then it gets worse again, that's where you should be questioning it. Because I think a lot of times people, we all grew up like, oh, you just got your bell rung, or you took a dirt nap, like get up and take some Motrin and keep moving, or whatever the case, that's
you're right about the Motrin.
Yep. Yeah. Drink water, take Motrin. Yeah, exactly.
Take Motrin and keep going.
Yeah, exactly. And I think because of that, we've learned to overlook some of the stuff that's going on. And also, I mean, let's face it, there are some times when you might have had a TBI blast, especially where you weren't really able to stop. And even though you might have noticed certain things that were off in the subsequent days or weeks, you were like, well, I don't really have a choice, because if I stop and get help, I'll be off this mission, off the team. I'm going to, whatever the case may be. And so a lot of times people might have known something was going on, but pushed it out of their mind just to keep going. You see this in athletes. I work with some folks from the NFL, and you see it in those guys all the time of, they're on all kinds of pain meds, and they just have to keep performing. And that's a question of, can you document it? Can you write it down? Can you pay attention? And then when you do have the space, if you can't do something about it in the moment, make sure that you're keeping track of your progress. If you're getting better, that's a good thing. If you're staying the same or getting worse and it's impairing your quality of life or your ability to do your job or relate to your friends or your spouse or your kids, like these are big issues. And that's where things should be looked at thoroughly. So with somebody who knows what they're doing. Because a lot of times you'll go into a physician, and if they don't have a good understanding or background in traumatic brain injury, they'll look at you and they'll be like, you're young and otherwise healthy, and or you're depressed. You're probably depressed. Let's get you on some antidepressants, or maybe you just need some testosterone, or and they kind of just treat the symptoms. And
did you read my medical record before you came here? Because I've had those conversations.
I've read many like it, I'm sure.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, and the endocrine dysfunction with traumatic brain injury is real. So that's something that really people should be aware of, men and women both. And
if you think you've had a traumatic brain injury, go get an endocrine panel pulled now.
Please. Yes.
Your vitamin D levels are probably below 30.
I mean, everybody's, I'm sure, these days. I don't know anyone who has like really healthy D levels, unfortunately, but
my wife's like over an 80.
Oh, wow.
Over an 80. Her doctor was like, you shouldn't have this much vitamin D. And she's like, I take like 50,000
Okay,
units.
But she has to take, yeah.
Oh,
okay.
yeah. She takes the dropper. Like
okay.
She makes it happen.
Yeah, right. Okay. But I think, when we say we're talking about endocrine function and hormones, I don't just mean testosterone. There are upstream hormones that are important to look at, and you need the whole picture, because you can start tinkering with physiology in ways that are supportive of your body getting back on track, or there are ways that you can tinker with it that sort of shut down your body's ability to naturally make this stuff. And you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. So again, talk to an endocrinologist or somebody who, one, will listen and trust that what you're saying is true, and then advise you appropriately.
So you're a young soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, or whatever. You're in the military, and you feel like something must have happened. I mean, it, most of the guys. I mean, you're a mortarman or whatever. The chronic,
trust it. Yeah.
What can be done? I mean, that's one suggestion there, but what should they be looking for? I mean, what are some of the signs, I guess, that they should be? Headache, fatigue, or what types of symptoms?
I mean, everybody's going to be a little bit different, especially depending on the type of injury and where maybe their brain was injured. I think the very obvious signs are fatigue is a huge one. Ability to concentrate and pay attention. Like if you used to have a fine memory and you were able to focus, and all of a sudden after an injury, you're just like, I mean, this happened to me. I've had some pretty bad TBIs myself, and I was actually teaching at a medical school when I received one, and I was mountain biking in New Zealand, and had a bad crash and went face first into a tree stump and had 25 sutures in my face, out, it was bad. And I came back and I had to teach medical students physiology, and I'm staring at my PowerPoints and none of it makes sense. And I'm reading and rereading things, and I'm like, oh my, things like that where you're like, this is clearly a problem. What is going on? Memory, ability to concentrate. Fatigue is a big one where, after an injury like that, you could be walking up a flight of stairs and be gassed. So pay attention to things like that. Mood shifts, this is a big one, especially in the more chronic phases. You'll see people who used to be super happy-go-lucky, kind of calm, chill people turn into like anger, irritability, impulsivity issues. So sometimes people end up becoming addicts to something after a TBI, or the ability to not become addicted to something starts to diminish, and that impulsivity can play a huge part in that. Sleep disturbances are another one, depression, all of these things that you know yourself better than anyone. You know what life has felt like for you. And if things feel different enough that you're like, this is not normal, this is not me, trust that. Don't listen to people who are like, it's nothing. Like, trust it. It's always worth the time to go explore. And the sooner you can get ahead of it, the better off you're going to be. So if you're exploring options, talking to physicians, and people are discounting you or not taking you seriously, keep trying until you find somebody who does, because you're going to encounter that. I mean, we all unfortunately are going to encounter that, whether it's a physical health doctor or a mental health doctor. We just sometimes it's like any profession. There are great ones and there are terrible ones. So just keep looking until you find somebody.
The soft community, I mean, just by the nature of the fact that they go on so many deployments and are that compounds the issue, because of course they're going to be exposed to these types of conditions more and more. I mean, you've had experience in working with a lot of those within the soft space. In those types of situations and stuff, is it kind of expanded from the norm in terms of, your average TBI here or there, type of situations? And can you elaborate for those guys who might still be in that space, either off active duty or currently living within that world? Deployments might be different, but in terms of volume and what the missions are, but they still may be experiencing some of the same types of traumatic brain injury.
Totally. And people have probably heard of this term by now, but operator syndrome.
Yes.
So Chris Free, he and his colleagues who wrote that paper and coined the term, he actually just came out with a book, by the way, on operator syndrome. And I think it's available for pre-order. I don't know that it's available until April of 2024. But for those interested in reading more about it, you can look at that there when it comes out. But there is a paper that describes kind of the symptoms I was just talking about. And it's very common in the soft community. TBI is also extremely common in the soft community. And most people who have sustained TBIs, it wasn't during combat, it was during training. So I think it was like 85% of operators have had TBIs during training, and then probably other people they've had more, whether it was through combat or even sports outside of, just athletics when they were young or even as adults. And so TBI is very common in the soft community, but let's remove TBI for just a second. If you look at the stressors associated with this profession, they're pretty significant. And I like the term operator syndrome because it gives us a name for what we're observing, this phenomenon that we're observing. And in order to do something about it, you have to categorize it so we're all sure that we're talking about the same thing. But I also think that it's a little too narrow, because then a lot of people start identifying with it. They're like, well, I must have operator syndrome. Like we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. It's like, well, I have this thing, and now they can internalize a diagnosis that's unhelpful. So I like to reframe operator syndrome in stress physiology terms, and that is the term that it's related to is called allostasis, which is the ability to maintain stability through changing environments. And you can kind of think about it like homeostasis, if it's a simpler term. But it's a dynamic thing. So it's meant to be, hey, the system gets perturbed and somehow we find our way back to a dynamic equilibrium that's appropriate for the conditions at that time. And this is a normal thing with stress. We have stress constantly. You have physical stressors, you have environmental stressors, you have psychological stressors. This is normal. We human beings deal with this every day. And we have a stress response system that is designed to help us adapt and be resilient in the face of these stressors. But when you look at certain professions, like special operations and being an operator, but even some first responders deal with this. When you look at the stressors that they're dealing with in all these different categories, psychological, physical, environmental, you see all of a sudden the amount that starts to pile up, and your body's ability, the stress response system's ability to bounce back from that, all of a sudden it gets pushed and it's starting to come back to baseline, and then there's another stressor that assaults the system, and it's like pushed a little further, and then it starts to bring things back, and then there's more stressors, and before you know it, things are so far from baseline that the stress physiology system is not able to bring things back, and you start to have severe dysfunction and dysregulation of normal processes. That's separate from TBI. TBI ends up contributing to this stress that you see. It's a very potent physical stressor, but you would have this stuff happening without a TBI. But then when you add that to the mix, now you've got the similar symptoms showing up from this stress physiology issue that you see with TBI, but now you've got both things happening. So it's even more impactful. And you really, I mean, you see people, you know, the list of symptoms from operator syndrome are exactly all the ones that I just mentioned, plus a whole other plethora. And unfortunately, suicide rates in this community are through the roof. And there's, you know, this understanding that a lot of these things we're talking about are huge contributors to that. So it's really important for people to pay attention. And to your point where you're saying before about, you know, sometimes you don't notice it, and it's like these people are speaking from this place of anger, and you can just see the irritability. It's like a slow boil for you, the individual. Maybe you don't notice it, but when people around you are telling you that you're different or that things are off, I know it sucks to hear that. Nobody wants to. I mean, that's hard for anyone to hear truthfully and own that, but pay attention to that. Trust the people around you who care about you. And if they're saying this stuff, that would be a time to start looking into maybe understanding what's going on, getting some help, because there are ways through it. Just like there's a long road that led you here, there are ways back. There are ways to get healthy. There are ways to address a lot of this stuff, but you have to work at it. And I want people to have hope in that, but it takes some effort, and you've got to. It's not going to just go away. You've got to address it. You talked about the stressors, then you talked about the TBI. You talked about, well, then you take the individual that's going through all those different types of things, and I think about like when you start trying to diagnose it and support it or fix it. There may be, like we just talked about, alcohol, certain medication. They're not eating healthy. They're not exercising right. So you're going to have to go through and start removing everything to bring it back, I'm assuming, to some symbol of baseline of normal as much as you can, and then start adding in and seeing what is actually contributing to the problem.
I would think it'd be like a diet by deletion, right? Where you go like water diet. Okay, I'm good with water. Let's add some bread. Okay, I'm good with bread. Add some milk. Oh, I can't eat milk, so we go back, and I think it'd be something
you're
like
going
that.
through a lot of this yourself.
Yeah, like it was, when it came to one, like sleep hygiene was huge. That was one that they really hammered on. Was like, how much sleep are you getting? Are you sleeping well? Yeah, you were in bed for 8 hours, but how long did you sleep? Then the sleep studies and all this other stuff. But that being said, like you had to find your baseline again. You had to find out what's normal for you. And there's only one way to do that, and that's start removing things and seeing where your body's actually functioning, where your brain's functioning, and what's happening. So I want to ask about environmental stressors. Like, what are some environmental stressors other than being in the military and everything that they should be watching out for?
Yeah, well, when I say environmental stressors, I'm talking like things in the environment. So especially this is relevant to an operational environment, but like altitude, heat stress, cold stress, toxins in the environment. You know, Hunter 7 is leading the charge in this. So we are all very aware of things that are toxic in the environment, whether it's in garrison or on deployments or whatever. There are things that are affecting your health, the water you're drinking, the plastics, like all of these things from the environment can contribute to the stressors, but they can also cause direct damage. I mean, some of these things are damaging to your DNA, or it just depends on what it is. So those are kinds of the environmental types of things, and then the physical stressors are going to be like the movement type stuff. So if you're working out intensely, like movement is good and it's healthy, but are you trying to kill yourself in the gym every day? Is that maybe counterproductive? Like, let's be honest. And then lack of sleep could be another physical stressor. A traumatic brain injury could be another type of physical stressor. And then you have the psychological ones, which in today's world, even outside of the military, I mean, people are not okay. They're dealing with all kinds of things that are, it could be family, it could be health, your health or a family member's health. It could be financial stress, job issues, lack of purpose, lack of meaning. You talk about this with transition and getting out of the military. You start to have some of these other things come up, and those activate the exact same system that a lion chasing you down the road is activating, and all of these things are addressing our physiology in a way where you can start to see, when you're looking at it this way, of like, whoa, I'm adding all these things up pretty quick. And so I always tell people, look at what's causing stress in your life. If there are things that you can actually eliminate and get rid of, do it, and there's some things that you can't, like psychological stressors can be pretty difficult to eliminate. But if you can address anything in your environment or the physical stressors, maybe do yoga once a week instead of a soul crushing workout at the gym, like balance that a bit. That's the best place to start. And then, to your point about the elimination stuff, I always tell people, try to choose things that you can stick with. Like, don't overwhelm yourself and say you have to make all these make all the changes overnight, because you're never going to stick with that, and then you're going to beat yourself up about being terrible. And so you got to pick things that you can sustain and add on to as time goes, and start small. That's the best way.
I'm finding it challenging. You mentioned the plastic and everything. I'm finding it so challenging every time I turn on like social media and start noticing all of these different things that could go wrong with your body because of stuff that you're inhaling or you're drinking. You know what I mean? It's like, how today are we supposed to even survive in this environment? And then especially someone like you're talking about that already is, I guess it's not necessarily predisposed, but you've got so many things that are going on in your body already that's unhealthy, from TBIs, post-traumatic stress, that you add all these other things that's now being described out there. And
it can be overwhelming, and you start to think like, well, I can't, like, I'm not doing any of this right. Like, even for people who listen to Andrew Huberman's podcast, you're like, shit, I didn't get my 20 minutes of sun today. I'm going to be depressed all day. Or, like, there's these protocols to life where we start to micromanage everything we do, and we judge it. And it's like, well, I didn't do the thing today, or I did the thing I wasn't supposed. And it's like the stress around doing it, quote unquote, right, can be worse for you than if you were to relax a bit about it. And so I'm saying this, it's both, right? It's like, be conscious as best you can and make changes where you can. Don't let it ruin your life to where you can't enjoy, like, you're thirsty and you need to drink some water and there's a plastic bottle sitting there. Drink the water. You're going to be okay. So there's a balance to it, and we all have to find the balance that works for us. I try to be as mindful as I can be about these things, eliminate what I can, and then I just let it go. And there are times when you're going to have to deal with things that maybe are not the best thing in that moment, but stressing about it might make it worse.
Yeah. They talk more and more, I guess I hear now, of like how important 8 hours of sleep is, and not just 8 hours, but preparing yourself for that sleep. And
you got to do the 3-2-1, Rob.
3-2-1?
3-2-1. 3 hours exercise, 2 hours eat, 1 hour no blue light.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a. That's a.
If you're going to bed at 8, you better be working out at 5. You know what I mean?
I know. Angela's got you like on a pattern and everything. You probably have a whole
no. That was
agenda.
That was like the first thing the sleep hygiene lady told me was 3-2-1.
Is it?
Before you go to bed, 3-2-1. 3 hours before you go to sleep, you need to exercise. 2 hours eat, 1 hour no electronics, no blue light, nothing.
I like that. I also tell people to like, if they're going to do a sauna or something like that, like doing that closer to bedtime, because there's in order for sleep to be triggered, there needs to be a drop in body temperature. So you think, well, sauna's going to raise it. It does, but when it comes back down, that's the signal to sleep. So if you can get yourself hot or warm,
like a really hot shower or hot bath.
Yeah, soak in the bath, or whatever that might be, a little bit before, like an hour or so before bed. Give yourself some time to let that temperature come back down. Make your room nice and cold. Climb into bed, and hopefully that can help. So that's an easy thing just as an assist. But all of those things that you mentioned are also great.
Look at me, sleep therapist.
Yeah. Meditation. I know you're big into meditating, doing yoga, those types of things. And
yeah, starting small, laying a foundation. And, sometimes you do start to have these wins where you notice like, oh my God, I did sleep well last night, or whoa, I woke up and I was super happy today. And, you'll start to notice that, but sometimes it doesn't happen overnight and people are like, oh, it's not working, I'm not going to do it. And so I just encourage people to pick a couple things and make a contract with yourself where you're like, okay, I can stick with this, but I'm going to stick with it for a set period of time. And if I'm still not noticing a difference, maybe I'll try something else, or maybe I'll do something else. And, but you've got to give it time. I mean, this stuff, it took a long time to get where you are today in this physiological state that you're in. You didn't get here overnight, and you're not going to be, reversing that overnight. So you just got to pick some things and constantly build the foundation and have some discipline around it. And, it's just a process. We all have to do it. I mean, no one's free from this kind of thing. We all have this stuff we've got to work on.
So I'm going to switch gears because right now, we had some people on the podcast that talked about this, going down and trying to find healing in South America and, exploring different opportunities, whether it's Mexico or whatever the case, where they can go through programs that are not legal here in America for us to do a lot of those things here. You experienced some of these yourself, and then you've also know loved ones and friends and stuff that have also done some of the same things. What have you seen in terms of the benefits, and what's the storyline there that's really people should take away?
Yeah. So I guess I'll couch this with just my experience with it. So I found out about psychedelics, and in particular ayahuasca, through a ranger friend of mine back in like 2018. And I had no idea what it was. And he seemed to have great benefit from it and definitely noticed some changes. And I was like, what is this about? Because this is interesting to me that this, he was dealing with this stuff, and now he seems to be like a new person in this after period. So I started doing some research and realized that there was actually research on psychedelics, but ayahuasca in particular, that showed pretty incredible things from a neuroscience standpoint. I was like, whoa, how am I just hearing about this? Like, why haven't I known about it? And so I contacted the organization that he went with, which is Heroic Hearts Project. And we got to talking, and I ended up becoming their director of research. And we started it was initially a gut microbiome study in veterans with PTSD, and looking at how ayahuasca impacted symptoms, but maybe was that through the gut? And we're actually wrapping that up, and hopefully we'll have a publication out soon about that, which is pretty exciting. Years later, of course, it takes a long time. But through that, I was like, I'm really curious what this entails. It's a traditional Peruvian, ayahuasca has comes from the Amazon, essentially. So places in Brazil and Peru and elsewhere where this has been a traditional ceremonial practice for a long, long time. We're talking, probably millennia at this point. And I didn't really know much about it, and so I wanted to understand what this is like. And I also felt like, from my own perspective, if I'm going to be doing research on this or talking about it, I should have an experience with it. And I've had my own struggles with addiction and an eating disorder for a very long time, and all kinds of my own mental health struggles and behavioral struggles that were tied to, who knows, brain injuries, trauma. It's hard to pinpoint why we end up the way that we end up. We always want to look back and be like, that was the reason. But for many of us, it's sort of like, does it even matter at some point, right? But I was dealing with these things and was like, I'm still struggling in a lot of ways myself, and I don't understand why. And I've tried all these different methods. I'm curious around what this might be able to help me with too, from a different perspective, not military. So I went with a group of veterans, a lot of Rangers in this group, really good friends of mine. And we went down and participated it was a week-long program, 3 ayahuasca ceremonies. And it's really hard to describe, but it is, it's a pretty incredible experience. It definitely shifts your perspective on everything in life, on yourself, on your problems, on the way that you look at the world. And there seems to be a really powerful antidepressant effect afterwards. And it's being studied. So ayahuasca is being studied in clinical trials in Brazil and I think Spain currently. But all these psychedelics, these serotonergic psychedelics that act on the serotonin system. So we're talking LSD and psilocybin, DMT, ibogaine, these different substances that you guys may have heard of. They seem to impact the serotonin system, and they all do it in a little bit of a different way. But there seems to be great promise in helping people see things differently and reframe trauma or their experience. And there's a powerful antidepressant effect for a lot of them. So I saw some of my friends. I mean, I had a couple of friends that were on the last leg that they had. I mean, they were like, if this, and this isn't the best mentality to go down there with, but for them, just being honest about it, they were like, if this doesn't work, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, not in a good place. And came out of that just completely different perspective on things. And like, I'm happy to be alive, I'm grateful, and I want to be here kind of mentality. It's hard. It's really hard work. A lot of times people will have very difficult experiences when they do this that, if not done in the right setting or with the right people or at the right time, could actually be really harmful. So it's not just, again, like, you know, there's a lot of narratives in the veteran space, especially about psychedelics these days, as being a silver bullet of, I was dealing with all this stuff and then all I needed was to go to Peru and do this, you know, be in the ceremony, and then all of that reversed. And I wish I could tell you that my own struggles with addiction and my eating disorder and all of that disappeared after that, but they didn't. So I'm saying that to say these things are powerful and they can be helpful, but they don't necessarily like fix you or quote unquote reverse everything that you're dealing with. They provide a new perspective on things and a window of opportunity to make better choices. So I've heard it described before that, especially with addictions or patterned thinking, like negative thinking, beating yourself up and having a really harsh inner critic, wanting to be different but not being able to make those changes. Those patterns, the repetitive thinking or the addictions, the more you do it, the more ingrained it gets. It's like riding a bike in mud, and you create a rut, and the more you ride in that same rut, the deeper it gets. And then one day you're like, hey, I want to go over there, and you try to turn, but you're so deep in the rut, it's like you can see where you want to go, but you can't go. That's like our behavior over time, whether it's thoughts or actually actions. Physical actions, it gets really difficult because we've done something for so long to make a change. What psychedelics seem to do is smooth out those ruts. There's a brief period of time where we have the ability to do it differently. And that's a really promising thing from a neuroscience standpoint, and from a psychology standpoint, that's huge. And people can take advantage of that in that after period. But if you don't do anything differently and you just go back to your same behavior, the ruts go right back to where they were, and you're the same person. And maybe it's even harder now because you had a glimpse of how good it could be and how free you could be, and then you come back and you're dealing with the same stuff again. So it can be super challenging. So I want to say that there's a lot of promise, and people are studying these substances in clinical trials for treatment-resistant depression and PTSD. There's a study that MAPS is doing with MDMA, and they're looking at MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in veterans with PTSD, and they've had incredible results. But a lot of the clinical trials focus on psychotherapy as being the main treatment, and the psychedelics are the tool that provides, I guess, better access or enhances the psychotherapy. So for those of us who grew up very like closed off and, you know, like stoic and out of touch with feelings and all these things, sometimes psychedelics can be used to open that up and provide access to places you don't want to go or wouldn't normally be able to go. And you can do that in a therapeutic setting and, again, reframe or change your perspective on life in a way that's actually really adaptive and helpful. So the clinical trials right now are looking at this stuff as a tool to be used in psychotherapy, not a tool that's going to do everything on its own. But Heroic Hearts Project, they're not doing psychotherapy, but what they're doing is providing coaching. So people like me will help people ahead of time to prepare and then help them integrate the process afterwards to make sure that they're putting good actions into place and doing things that are supportive of the changes that they want to make. But you do hear a lot. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have heard success stories in the veteran community of people saying that this changes their lives or it saved them. And I think that that's valid. I mean, it's happening. I just also want to caution people that that's not a guarantee, and you still have to do a lot of really hard work. This isn't going to fix everything, but it can be a really powerful tool if you're ready. But there are people who don't necessarily want to go down this path and don't feel like you can't also achieve the same outcomes outside of psychedelics too. I don't want to have people be like, well, I don't want to do that, and am I like not going to be able to get there because of that? Like, absolutely you can through other means, but this just accelerates that process, I guess, if that's a good way to put it.
So the way I've heard it described is that it often like creates neural pathways or changes the route, so to speak, is how it's described. You may have been, right now it may have been routed a specific way. I'm going from here to Washington along certain interstates, but all of a sudden Waze or Google Maps says, turn here, and reroutes you into a different path that's less congested. Would you say that it does a lot of that in terms of the process, or it's more of a rarity that occurs?
Yeah, I would say that it definitely does. I mean, there are really cool neuroscience studies out there that show under the influence like of psilocybin, magic mushrooms, for example, you have this increase in global connectivity in the brain. So parts of the brain that don't normally talk to each other are now talking to each other. And the theory is that it's providing some flexibility in the ways that we think about things and process things. Whereas before, say somebody presents you with a problem, you see two solutions. When under the influence of psilocybin or something like that, or in the period afterwards, somebody asks you the same question, now maybe you see 10 solutions, and you just see things differently. You connect the dots differently, and that can be really powerful for making positive changes in life, or, like to your point, going in that other direction. And it's something that is a pretty unique experience. You talk to people who are really long time meditators who have had just years and years of practice. They can seem to tap into this same sort of mechanism as well, but that's not usually accessible to the majority of us who sit down with like Headspace for 5 minutes. So psychedelics can be a powerful tool for achieving that faster. For the average human. And for those who have a real problem with depression, or even with, I worked with a lot of guys who, and some women who had really strong barriers up for self-love and connection with other people. And it was just a completely foreign concept to them. They might have had an idea in their head of what that might be like, and like most things, we can kind of conceptualize it, but until you experience it in your physical body, it's a concept. You don't really own it. You don't have wisdom around it. And sometimes with psychedelics, you get to actually have a real experience with something and feel it in your body where it clicks and you're like, oh my God, I totally understand. I get that. And love, especially with certain psychedelics, especially like MDMA, that can be a really powerful tool for helping people access that connection with themselves, but then the connection to their loved ones or complete strangers or the earth or whatever it might be. And it's, can they get there outside of that? Yeah, but how long will that take for some of these people? And they'd have to have the right therapist and really actively work on this. And of course you can get there, but this is a way, again, it takes concepts and turns it into like a felt sense. That's really powerful. So I really like these tools for that.
I've got two questions. One would be related to describing a little bit more about the actions or the work that an individual has to take when they return from these types of situations. And then the second question would be about what if they're just not able to? They're out of the military and they're employed in an environment where this is just not going to be possible as much as they want to go, or they're currently on active duty and they want to find a way that maybe is not psychedelics or anything like that, but like you said, there are opportunities that are available. What would those be, and maybe what does that path look like?
So for people who want to make the most of this afterwards, that's the question of kind of like, what do you do afterwards? I think for a lot of people, having support in your immediate environment with whether it's a spouse or other family members or friends who know what you're doing and are there to support you on your journey, that's super important. So you're going to be making changes in life, and before you even go, if you're in relationship with anybody, when you change, they are forced to change in some way too. And discussing what that's going to be, of the ideal life of, hey, when I come back, I really want to make these changes. That's not always easy to do with like a partner, for example. Having those discussions ahead of time are really important though, because if you come back and you're like, I'm so motivated to do all these things, but your environment is the same and maybe unhealthy, and it's crushing you, and that was part of the reasons that you had struggles to begin with. If you come back to that environment, it can be really challenging. So you really have to make sure that your space is set up well, that you at work, you've got some idea around how you're going to be able to show up in this new improved version of you that you want to be showing up as. And then with your significant other, or your kids, or whatever, your friends, alcohol is a big thing that you have to cut out prior and after for a period of time, sometimes caffeine too. And that can be challenging for people, especially if people are like, hey, I actually don't want to go do that at all anymore. But their friend group is like, oh man, come on. And especially in certain communities, people kind of tease each other a little bit about that. So knowing that ahead of time, knowing that you're going to be different and want to be different and make changes, you have to think about how that's going to play out in all these different arenas in life and be prepared for that so it doesn't blindside you and that you don't slip back into old ways of being. And having people in your life who support you and are reminding you and holding you accountable, like, hey, you said you were going to do these things, and I see you don't want to do it today, but you said you were going to do it. Like, that's really, really important. Journaling is a big thing for measuring progress. So I always encourage people to journal when they come home and look at where things go. And you're probably gonna, they call it a honeymoon phase, but it wears off sometimes. And then you might feel down again. You might have struggles. I mean, this is a normal human thing. You're never going to be on cloud 9 for the rest of your life. So you're going to slide backwards sometimes. Know that that's coming and be prepared for it. So when it happens, you're not like, oh shit, it didn't work. Or I'm just like I was before. You can open your journal and be like, actually, I'm not like I was before. I might be having a hard day, but look at all this progress I've made. So that's really important. And I think that's the thing that people overlook the most. They're just like, I feel so good. I don't need to worry about that. I'll deal with it when I deal with it. And then all of a sudden they have nothing in place, no structure. Mm-hmm. And it's like a disaster.
Now, is that like some of the emotional sensitivity that I've heard about, like with some people coming back from those experiences, like they're like uber sensitive?
Yeah. Yeah. You're a bit raw afterwards for most people. Like things, I mean, I remember coming back and I cried at the airport, literally leaving that next day. And I was just overwhelmed. And it wasn't sadness or joy. It was just the overwhelm of being alive. And airports are busy. There's a lot of stimulation, but it's you're very raw and emotional. And that can be a really good thing if you have a partner that understands and is, or kids or, friends that understand and they're willing to meet you there. But it can be really uncomfortable and sometimes harmful if you come back as this open person willing to connect and the people in your life are get out of here. I don't want, that can actually be really painful when you're ready for that. And these people are completely disconnected and pushing that away because you don't have anywhere to go with it then. So you need to find a way to allow that to continue to flow. Because if you don't, you'll shut it down and you'll go back to feeling blocked as well. And that once you've had that openness and freeness, that can be really traumatic to have to shut that down again. So I encourage people to maybe it's a coach, but like identify people in your life where you can show up fully in that way and feel free to do that without being shut down or judged or whatever. So that's another piece that, often gets overlooked. But, and then the other question about what do you do if you're active duty? Yeah. So hopefully, at this point, MDMA is likely to become legal this year or next year. And that would be legal in a clinical setting in a therapeutic, like psychotherapy way. So you could, if you're depressed, for example, or dealing with PTSD, potentially go to a clinician and get a prescription for MDMA assisted psychotherapy and could potentially do that. So these things are on the horizon, that they will be changing in the future. I'm confident in that, but we're not there yet. So what do people do? Obviously, if you're on active duty or in certain professions, I have a friend who's a federal agent, can't do any of this stuff. So there are ways to do similar kinds of work. So ketamine is one option. Ketamine is completely legal. And there are clinics that do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy or like psycholytic therapy. So the idea with that being that you might take a low dose of ketamine and have a therapy session with that on board, so you're able to access some things that may normally be blocked. Now, ketamine is not a psychedelic. It's a completely different mechanism of action. However, it does seem to have some similar effects in that it can kind of break down these walls that people might normally have up to memories or emotions and things that are typically stored away pretty tightly. So it can be useful for that and in an actual therapeutic session, but there are also ways that people do it where they have a really high amount on board and they send them off on their little journey with some eye shades and some music, and then they process it with a coach or a therapist after the fact. Those can be really powerful. I have some friends who swear by it as saving their lives. I have other friends who have done it who had some hard times and were like, I'm not sure that was helpful. Other people did it and they were like, yeah, it was helpful for a little while, but I have to go do it every week and that's not feasible. So ketamine can be a little expensive. So for people on active duty, that is an option, and these clinics are popping up all over. But a word of caution that anything in this space these days, people are trying to make money off of it because it is, up and coming and it is lucrative. So you got to really vet your people and trust the folks that you're working with. The other thing, depending on what people are dealing with, so, this is a different approach for different reasons, but with this sympathetic overdrive and this, high activation, high stress response, and being hypervigilant and on and unable to sleep, and these really intense like anxiety type symptoms that you can get when you have your stress response system overloaded. Sometimes people can find benefit with something like a stellate ganglion block. And that can be something that provides relief. Now, it doesn't fix the problem. It can buy somebody a period of time of relief so they can make better changes. And you're nodding your head, so it sounds like you have very personal.
I've had one. That was what actually my first 2 episodes as a guest was about.
Yeah,
was pre-SGB and post-SGB.
Okay.
It is not a silver bullet.
Right.
It does help symptoms. It takes work after the fact, and that's the big thing. Is it is simply step one to an 1,000,000-step journey.
Yeah, and when people are, when you're spending all of your waking energy holding yourself together, just trying to manage your day-to-day, which is a lot of people, if you could do something that bought you a breather, like that would be a lot. That would be really powerful. And so for some people, a stellate ganglion block could be that thing. Ketamine therapy could be that thing. For some people who have pretty intense trauma tied to like a focal event, like a car accident or something that's very clear, like had a beginning and end. Sometimes EMDR therapy can be something like that, where it provides some relief, where you're not.
EMDR is the
electromagnetic directional.
It's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So that's where you're in therapy, and they'll kind of, touching the microphone.
That's right.
Where you're tracking, your eyes are moving laterally, or you're doing bilateral tapping, things like that, where it's very, seems weird, but it's rooted in neuroscience. So essentially when you're recalling a traumatic memory and you're doing this bilateral eye movement, there's an access to this traumatic memory that was stored maybe improperly, like in post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes these traumatic memories get stored in a way where they seem like they're still happening in real time, and you're hypervigilant and you have nightmares and flashbacks and all these symptoms associated with PTSD. If you can access that memory and repackage it in a way that's a cohesive unit, and then your brain is like, oh, this is a discrete thing that happened in the past. It's not happening now. Your physiological symptoms of feeling like it's still happening subside. And EMDR, this lateral eye movement, again, Huberman explained this on a podcast once, but there's neuroscience pathways that are neural pathways that can explain how this works, and it allows you to essentially repackage these traumatic memories. And so that can buy somebody physiological relief from PTSD for a specific event. Now, for people with like more chronic PTSD, it doesn't seem to work as well. But again, it's knowing yourself, knowing what is going on for you, and then figuring out what is leading to all of these things that I'm dealing with. What are the tools out there that we know of? What do I start as a foundation? What are like the big heavy hitters, like a psychedelic approach or something like that? What are the things on a daily basis I need to do? What are the big powerful tools? How do I figure out the right plan forward for me as the individual? And it's going to be different for every single person. And that's like the coaching that I do is all figuring that out with the person of your unique situation. Where are you? How did you get here? And then what are the things that we need to tackle in what order? Which tools are available? How do we integrate the right tools at the right time? And then let's create a plan and move forward with it. And a lot of us, unfortunately, just have to be guinea pigs and figure out, like I've used myself as a guinea pig for a lot of this, of just trying to figure out, well, how does this feel? What works for me? What doesn't? And then relay that to clients that I work with. So I have a better understanding of maybe what could help a unique person or not. But just because it worked for somebody else doesn't mean it'll work for you or vice versa. So listen to people's stories, absolutely learn from them, and know that you're going to kind of have to create your own path forward. But share that story, because again, that could help other people in the process.
Well, and I've watched you, Kyle, in terms of like, the stellate ganglion block. Prior to that, your adjustment in your eating habits and sleep and those types of things, and trying to do the gut health improvements and vitamins and working out and all that type of stuff. And then, like I said, the stellate ganglion block. And then it sounds like, there's this defrag thing sounds really cool with the EMDR, which would allow you then to potentially, maybe that's the next step, is that you kind of move that over, and then maybe it's ketamine. So it sounds like there's like even with this, there's no magic pill. There's no like map that says, okay, for you, Kyle, you go this path. Mm-hmm. It might be a little bit of, no, we're going to turn the screw to the right a little bit. No, that didn't work. All right, well, we're going to adjust the left screw now to the left, and see, and playing around with that a little bit. And maybe that's, again, my pea brain trying to process this, but
yeah. I mean, and I think people should look at it with some curiosity and like a little bit of an adventure, because it usually is. It's like, well, I tried this for 6 weeks and didn't like it. Or I had a client once who was very more dogmatic Christian beliefs, and yoga was absolutely off the table. He was like, no way, man, I'm going to be indoctrinated with some crazy, I don't know. And I was like, no, man, it's secular. Like we don't have to talk about anything religious. You're not going to have somebody like jump into your third eye and possess your soul.
Say namaste right now.
But like for him, it was like a non-starter. And I was like, okay, that's not a tool for you. Cool. Like what else do we have available to us? And I think people just kind of have to go through it like that, of kind of figuring out what they have access to, because some of these things aren't even available in your own area. So you've got to think about that too, or maybe it's cost prohibitive, or, there's a lot to consider with all of this, but you do kind of have to create your own path forward with it. But
So that guy didn't opt for the drum circle therapy or anything like that either? No.
no, sir. Did not. Yeah. But I think the other thing too, one other piece of this that I really want to emphasize is that you can do all of the tools, you can do everything available to address your physical and potentially your mental health too. But if you don't have a community or people that you're close with, it doesn't have to be a huge community. It could be your spouse and a couple friends, or your kiddos, or you know, or just friends, or maybe it's your extended family. But we all need people, and you can do all the other stuff. But if you don't have people in your life, and if you don't have a sense of purpose, what you're here for, what you're doing, those other things are going to help, but they're only going to get you so far. And I would also add, for those who are spiritual, a spiritual connection of some kind too. That's also, you know, big for a lot of people. And if you're lacking those things as human beings, we're going to not be optimal. That's just the way we're wired. So I also encourage you to look at those parts of your life too, and see how else you can address that. And sometimes when you get those things right, the physical and mental start to improve too, and then you don't have as big of a laundry list of things that you need to address, or maybe they're more addressable. So it all goes hand in hand. Like, you know, we're not machines as much as people would like to think that we are. We are human beings, and this stuff is complex, but it is workable, and there are lots of tools and solutions out there. But we've got to explore it. We've got to be willing to get out there and explore, and ask for help when needed too.
I think that's awesome, the way you kind of laid that out. I mean, and having been in the life sciences space myself after getting off of active duty, and learning a lot about genomics or different DNA makeup and stuff, and especially about certain drugs and receptors, and how about each human is different, and in terms of what works well. Somebody might work great with Tylenol, another person might have to use ibuprofen, or another person has to use something a little bit more heavy, and so we think about those things in our own life, but we're not thinking about it in the way you're describing of, hey, not everything is going to fit each person the same way. So Kyle may go through this program. You may hear him on the podcast tell his story about getting the stellate ganglion block and having huge success. Another person may go there and go, didn't work. Mm-hmm. Nothing happened.
Yeah.
You know, I don't feel any results. Yet a third person may go, I didn't have to do this for like 3 years. Mm-hmm. It lasted that long. And I've heard, you know, stellate ganglion block lasting like 30 days for some people.
Yeah.
We've had several people that said, yeah, I had to take it, but man, it was like quick. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, and I've noticed with a lot of folks that I've worked with, if it gets bad enough, you're willing to put in the work. We're weird creatures in that we often have to hit rock bottom, and maybe more than once, before we're like, oh, okay, this isn't working. I got to actually put some effort in or do things differently. And so that's normal. It's unfortunate that we're that way, but we are wired that way. It is normal. And I get it. I mean, I'm one of those people. I've had my own path that's very similar to what you're describing. I mean, I'm sitting here talking about this stuff, and it's not from a book. This is my own personal experience too. I've gone through all of this stuff and speak about it from a place of like true understanding. So I get it. And I think the individual has to decide, how bad do you want it? How bad do you want to get better? And for some people, the effort part is hard, especially when you're depressed. It's very hard to put the effort in, but that's where you have to ask for help. And, you'll start having the energy to do the things that you need to do. And sometimes it just takes time and age, and sometimes it takes really hard circumstances, and we're again, because we're all different, it'll be different for each person what brings them to that place of change. But
I want to say something. Not only thank you for coming all this way once again and stuff, but people may listen to this episode and go, all right, hey, I am on social media. We talked about that. I want to know more about how I can follow Kate, learn more about your experiences, what you're doing, and you post amazing stuff, and we've made connections on a number of different posts because it's, we see it in our community, and I've seen it and experienced some of these things within my own life. So getting a chance to see even some of the memes you share, some of the health stuff that you post about, that makes you think. and you do some amazing posts on that, where you get not only into the science of it, but you give a lot of thought-provoking stuff. So how can people learn more about your journey and if they want to follow you, and not only that, but some of the things you shared here in the podcast?
Yeah, I guess probably the easiest way to see what I'm up to or get a hold of me is Instagram. I'm Doc Pate, DOC.PATE. And then if people want to email me and reach out and have specific questions, I don't always have the answers, but I know a lot of really smart people and people with huge hearts that are often willing to help. So I'm great at making connections. And if you want to email me, it's docpate@proton.me. So that's another easy way. And then I'm trying to work on a website. I'm not a website person, and social media, all I have is Instagram. I'm not one of those people that does that well.
You haven't blogged or anything yet?
I've been encouraged to, and I really want to, but I also am trying to figure out how to do that. I don't know if people out there know how to make websites.
Rob, she's saving the world one page at a time. You have to leave her alone. She ain't got time to blog.
So yeah, I'm probably going to make a website at some point and then have blogs and stuff like that. Cause there's a lot that I want to.
We got a guy for the website.
Yeah, you got a guy. Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah. There's a lot that I want to share, and Instagram, your 2,000 word or your 2,000 character posts. It's not enough for me. So there's more I want to share on all these topics, and even my own personal journey that I don't always share as much on social media. But hopefully in the near future, I'll get into that more. So,
and nowadays, for what you're talking about, you have to give up a lot of your personal self, and we're not all comfortable in doing that when you're out there. Some people want to do that.
Yeah.
God bless them. But for some of us, we want to remain private. So,
sure.
But I appreciate what you do share. Because what you are putting out there is helpful information, and it's what really connected us together and stuff, and trying to get you on the show was, what you were putting out there, people mentioning your name, obviously, and those types of things, and the stuff that you're doing out there. You mentioned, of course, the nonprofit that you've worked with, but also just, working in the space in the community, word of mouth travels. Mm-hmm. And so appreciate everything that you're doing out there within the community space as well.
Yeah, thank you. Honestly, I couldn't have imagined being able to do what I do in this community, and all of the things I'm most passionate about, I get to do, and I work with my best friends, and I get to make incredible friendships and meet people like you guys, and I'm just so grateful that I get to do this stuff. So it's a true blessing.